I wasn't looking for a conspiracy when I started this. I was tracing the administrative history of charitable institutions, the kind of dry archival work that fills footnotes nobody reads. Public records, founding charters, parliamentary debates about poverty relief, standard historical background. Then I found the ledgers, intake columns running for pages, names, ages, dates of admission, and beside them, the outcome columns, thin, sparse, often blank. Children admitted by the thousands, children accounted for afterward by the dozens. I kept assuming I'd misread the records. I hadn't. The numbers didn't balance. They never balanced. Once you see that, you can't look at the institutions the same way again. The Foundling hospitals weren't hidden. That's the first thing to understand. They were celebrated, announced in newspapers, funded by royal decree, named after their patrons, visited by dignitaries who wanted to be seen caring about the destitute children of Europe's expanding cities. Thomas Coram opened his hospital in London in 1739 and was painted by Hogarth. Catherine the Great established the Imperial Foundling Home in St. Petersburg in 1764 and wrote personally about its importance to the civilized project of the Russian state. The Paris institution dated to the 17th century and was referenced in every major survey of French social administration. These were not secret places. They were monuments, which makes what the records show considerably stranger. The intake numbers are not disputed. Coram's hospital admitted more than 16,000 children before 1800. The St. Petersburg home processed more than 37,000 in its first few decades. The Paris institution received more than 5,000 infants per year at certain points in the late 1700s. These figures come from the institution's own surviving documentation, not estimates, not projections. Actual ledger entries, catalogued, archived, partially digitized. The numbers are there. What isn't there, in proportionate quantity, are the outcome records, where the children went, what became of them. The intake columns fill pages. The outcome columns are thin, inconsistent, and in several cases simply stop. The official explanation is administrative. Record keeping in the 1700s was imperfect. Mortality rates were genuinely catastrophically high in institutional settings. Many children died before outcomes could be recorded. Others were discharged informally, apprenticed to local tradespeople, placed with rural families, and the paperwork didn't follow them. Historians of childhood and poverty cite these explanations, then move to the next section. The gaps are noted, they are not investigated. Acknowledge, categorize, move on. Never ask what the gap actually represents when the institution maintaining the records was a state-funded operation with professional administrative staff and a legal obligation to account for its population. But the mortality argument has a structural problem. The institutions kept death records carefully. Deaths required documentation for both ecclesiastical and administrative purposes. Burial registers survive in most cases. They account for a significant portion of intake. Added to the traceable outcomes, apprenticeships recoverable through guild records, marriage registers, military enrollment documents. They still don't reach the total number of children admitted. A residual category remains. Researchers call it unaccounted. They file it under administrative imperfection. They do not ask what unaccounted means when it appears consistently across every institution examined across every country, across the full span of the period, not occasionally, systematically. The buildings are harder to dismiss than the records. Coram's complex on Guildford Street was a sprawling Georgian structure with formal gardens, administrative wings, a chapel, and dormitory blocks arranged with the deliberate geometry of institutional design. The St. Petersburg home was purpose-built at significant scale. Internal corridors wide enough to move large numbers of people efficiently, classification rooms numbered dormitories, administrative offices positioned at junctions allowing oversight of multiple wings simultaneously. This is not the architecture of charity. It is the architecture of management. The same layout appears in the Vienna Findelhaus, in the Milan institutions established under Napoleonic administration, in the early American orphan asylums appearing in New York and Boston in the 1800s. The template reproduces. The proportions reproduce. The internal logic, intake, classification, allocation, administration, reproduces across institutions separated by thousands of miles and nominally independent founding histories. Why? Why does a London merchant's charitable impulse produce a building with the same internal organisation as a structure commissioned by Catherine the Great? Why do institutions founded decades apart in different countries, under different legal and religious frameworks, converge on the same architectural solution? The standard answer is diffusion. Reformers corresponded, visited each other's institutions, imported successful models. But diffusion explains the template only if the template was designed for the stated purpose. If the purpose was simply housing abandoned children until placement in apprenticeships, the architecture is excessive, the classification infrastructure is unnecessary, the scale of the administrative apparatus outstrips the charitable mission by a margin that diffusion alone cannot explain. The geographic pattern makes the clustering impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Between roughly 1740 and 1850, Foundling infrastructure is established or massively expanded across Britain, France, Russia, Austria, the Italian states, Spain and its colonies, and the early American Republic, simultaneously within the same historical window. In St. Petersburg, a state-funded intake system scaled for tens of thousands. In Paris, a prefectural apparatus managing annual infant volumes that would strain a modern logistics operation. In London, a royally chartered institution integrated with naval recruitment pipelines. In Vienna, Milan, New York, the same template, the same decades, the same administrative DNA. When the same institutional form appears across unconnected polities in the same century, historians look for the common pressure that produced it. For Foundling hospitals, the common pressure is identified as urbanisation and social dislocation. The explanation is accepted, the pattern is filed. But these are the same decades that this channel has been mapping, the same decades in which administrative systems across multiple empires are quietly consolidated and standardized, the same decades in which the architectural vocabulary of governance begins to be retrofitted with explanations emphasizing aesthetic choice rather than functional requirement. Why does Foundling hospital expansion cluster in precisely the same window as these other administrative reorganizations? Why the same geographic footprint? Britain, France, Russia, Central Europe, colonial extensions. Why do the outcome records fail in exactly the places where children transferred into naval, colonial and industrial systems the state needed populated? Why does scholarship across 2 centuries of research decline consistently and across every national tradition to pursue the residual category that the numbers require? Not coincidence, not independent failure, pattern. And when you trace the pattern across continents and across the full span of the period, the official explanation stops bearing the weight placed on it. Consider what the Foundling hospital system actually required to function at the scale it operated. 37,000 children through a single institution in St. Petersburg in its first decades. 5,000 infants per year arriving at the Paris gates in the late 1700s. These are not numbers that a charitable impulse sustains. These are numbers that require supply chains, contracts with rural wet nurses paid on per-infant schedules, transportation networks moving infants from urban intake points to distributed care locations and back, procurement systems for food, clothing, bedding, medical supplies, at volumes that would strain a military quartermaster. The Foundling hospitals were not philanthropic gestures that happened to grow large. They were large from the beginning, designed to be large, funded at a scale that only makes sense if someone needed them to be large. The funding sources tell you what the institutions actually were. Coram's hospital attracted royal charter and parliamentary interest within years of opening, and its alumni pipeline fed directly into naval and military apprenticeship systems. The St. Petersburg institution was imperial from its first day. Catherine's personal project, administered by officials reporting into the same bureaucratic structures that managed conscription and labour allocation across the empire. The Viennese institutions operated under Habsburg administrative supervision. The French system, reorganised through the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, ended up embedded in the prefectural apparatus, the same apparatus managing taxation, military recruitment, and civil registration. In every case, the trajectory is identical. Charitable origin gives way to state integration. The institutions that began as expressions of private mercy become instruments of public administration. And the public administration that absorbs them is precisely the administration responsible for population management, labour supply and military manpower. This is where the outcome records become something other than administrative failure. Apprenticeship was a legal status in every European jurisdiction of the period. It required documentation, created obligations on both sides, generated paperwork that survives in guild records, parish registers, court documents when disputes arose. The paper trail for a properly apprenticed child is recoverable, at least partially, even 2 centuries later. Researchers have done this work. They have traced Foundling Hospital alumni into apprenticeship records, marriage registers, military enrollment documents. The tracing is possible. The numbers still don't balance. The residual category persists after every recoverable destination has been identified and subtracted. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but consistently enough, across enough institutions, across enough countries, that the pattern cannot be individual administrative failure. It is systemic. And systemic gaps in managed administrative records are not accidents. They are decisions. Naval registers are the clearest case. Several foundling hospitals in Britain and France maintained formal agreements with naval recruitment systems. Boys of appropriate age, 12 to 14 was the common threshold, were transferred in groups directly into naval service. The agreements are documented. What is not documented is the subsequent tracking. The naval transfer records that survive suggest the numbers were significant. What is almost entirely absent is any chain connecting a named child from intake through transfer to a recoverable naval identity. The thread breaks at the transfer point, systematically. A child moves from one administrative system into another, and the documentation linking them is cut. Not lost, cut. The institutions that maintained meticulous intake ledgers, that recorded wet nurse contracts and clothing allocations and dormitory assignments, did not maintain the one record that would allow a researcher to follow a child past the point of transfer. Once you see that specific absence, precise record keeping everywhere except at the exit, you cannot explain it as imperfection. The colonial rosters confirm the pattern. Transportation records from Britain and France document the movement of foundling hospital children to colonial settlements. The Americas, Australia after 1788, French colonial territories. Some is openly documented as policy, populating underdeveloped colonial land grants with labour. The Virginia Company had operated similar schemes in the early 1600s, sourcing children from London parishes for colonial indenture. By the 1700s, the practice was more formalised, more bureaucratic, more integrated with foundling hospital administration. Children transported under indenture arrangements disappeared into colonial settings without the documentation infrastructure that would allow tracing. Colonial record-keeping was inconsistent. Indentured labour was not a population administrators were motivated to track carefully. The children arrived, the records stopped. In London, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, in Vienna. The exit point is always where the documentation ends, and the destination is always a system the state needed populated. The framework that makes sense of all of this is not charitable. Charity doesn't require classification infrastructure at the scale, visible in the surviving architectural record. Charity doesn't require direct integration with naval recruitment, military conscription pipelines, and colonial labour transportation systems. Charity doesn't require state funding at volumes implying a state interest in maintaining throughput. What requires all of those things is a managed population system, an intake and allocation mechanism for human beings administratively separated from any family or community connection that would create friction in their movement. Children without parents, without documented origins, without anyone positioned to ask where they went. The founding hospital system produced exactly that. A population processed through institutions that classified and allocated them into labour categories the state needed filled. The buildings were the infrastructure. The records were the management tool. The gaps in the records are where the allocation happened. Look at the architecture without the plaque. The wide internal corridors accommodate the movement of groups, not individuals. The classification rooms sit between intake and dormitory allocation. You are sorted before you are housed. Administrative offices overlook multiple dormitory wings simultaneously, the same spatial logic as a factory floor or a military barracks. The chapel is present but peripheral, serving legitimating function rather than organisational function. The garden spaces in institutions like Karams are formal and supervised. Exercise yards designed for managed outdoor time, not play. This is not the architecture of a home. It is the architecture of a system that processes people at volume and allocates them to destinations determined by administrators. Once you see the floor plan as processing infrastructure, the proportions stop being excessive. They become exactly right for the actual function. The buildings still stand. Coram's complex is now a museum and events venue. Parts of the St. Petersburg home are incorporated into a university campus. The Viennese institution serve medical and administrative purposes. The plaques describe founding missions in the language of compassion, relief of the destitute, care for the abandoned, education of the unfortunate. We read the plaques. We look at Hogarth's portrait of Coram, formal, benevolent, proud. We don't look at the classification rooms. We don't count the corridors. We don't ask why a charity needed administrative oversight infrastructure scaled for a population 10 times the dormitory capacity, or why the outcome records fail in exactly the places where children entered systems the state needed supplied. We accept the explanation on the plaque because it is the only explanation that has ever been offered. The ledger sits in an archive in London. The intake column runs for 40 pages. The names are there. Thomas, age 4 days. Marie, age unknown. A notation in the margin. Healthy, male, suitable. Suitable for what is not recorded. The outcome column for that page has 6 entries. The page held 83 names. The burial register accounts for perhaps a dozen more. That still leaves children, named, admitted, notated as suitable, for whom no destination exists in any record. They were processed, they were allocated, and then the documentation, maintained with such care at every prior stage, simply ends. The buildings remember the founders, the plaques remember the mission, the ledgers remember the names. What the records do not contain, what 2 centuries of scholarship across every national tradition has not required to be explained, is where the children went. That question has not been asked. And when you notice that it hasn't been asked, that an entire field has catalogued the intake numbers, and the architectural surveys, and the institutional biographies, and consistently decline to pursue what the numbers require, you arrive at a different question entirely. Not where did the children go, but why has no one needed to know?